Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me fine. Okay. So before I begin, I want to thank Youngju for the very warm introduction. And I also want to thank the Nam Center for Korean Studies for this wonderful invitation to return to my alma mater, although albeit virtually, and for giving me an opportunity to share a bit of my work that's in progress at a very crucial time in its formation. And I also want to thank Evan in particular for looking after all the arrangements for today's event. Before I go on, let me share my PowerPoint. Okay. So the material that I will be sharing with you today is from my current book project on the culture of protest in South Korea, in which I examined the development of the song movements spanning the 1970s and the 80s in the context of the broader anti-authoritarian resistance, with a particular emphasis on the songs that continued to resonate in Korea and as well as beyond Korea. I'm sorry. Beyond Korea for various socio-political purposes. So in my talk today, I will be focusing on one song in particular that bears significance for a lot of major figures, events, and memories of democratization movement in the 1980s, specifically those that embody the legacies of student activism. The song is called 그날이 오면, or When That Day Comes, as a text of a genre that came to be loosely categorized as 민중가요, or what might be translated as people's songs. When That Day Comes was originally written to commemorate the death of a labor activist named Chun Tae-il. By the mid-1980s, 민중가요 became the mainstay of the sonic repertoire of protest in South Korea. As I elaborate on the birth and subsequent dissemination of one of the examples of 민중가요, 그날이 오면, today, I will be tracing the development of South Korean song movement through the growth and evolution of noraep'ae, or song clubs, which operated as major conduits for the creation of protest songs, by taking them and the power of the performed word beyond the confined space of college campuses. In the process of doing so, I will be examining the unique aspects of performativity and movement politics that shaped both the broader contours as well as the textual and sonic elements of South Korean song movement in the 1980s. But before getting deeper into the story of how and where it all started, would like to begin by sharing a few scenes from a recent South Korean film from 2017, which is titled 1987. As the titular year implies, the film depicts the chain of events in the last year of Chun Doo-hwan regime that was set off by the news of a Seoul National University student, Park Jong-chul, who dies as a result of being tortured during a police investigation. The death by torture of a young college student galvanizes a dynamic range of real-life figures in the film: prosecutor, doctors, prison guards, reporters, and dissident activists in a battle on multiple fronts to uncover the truth against the vices of the regime. In the penultimate sequence, the tempo and tension of the film culminates in a student demonstration taking place at Yonsei University, during which one protester encounters a fatal injury from being hit by a tear gas canister shot by the riot police. As the film restages the iconic image of the injured student being carried off by a fellow protester, the audience discovers that the fallen student is none other than Lee Han-yeol. The film is therefore bookended by the actual deaths of two university students who would go on to be remembered as the most emblematic martyrs of the June uprising of 1987. But what sustains the film's reality effect lies with another character, Yeon-hee, who is played by Kim Tae-ri, who's a fictional protagonist in the film, and the songs that intertwine her to the overall story. Marking her as a typical college freshman of the time is her daily pastime activity of listening to the radio where her favorite songs are aired, those of the late Yoo Jae-ha, who was a representative ballader of the 1980s. More enthralled by the prospects of going on group blind dates or meeting and owning her very own portable cassette player, Yeon-hee begins wavering in her disinterestedness with social political affairs after her encounter with Lee Han-yeol, who is already, at that point in the film, positioned within the 운동권 or the movement sphere. In his last attempt to invite Yeon-hee into that sphere, Lee Han-yeol hands her flyers commemorating the late Park Jong-chul. And these flyers were made through a mimeograph in the 동아리 or circle that he belongs in. The last sheet is the music score of the film's central song, namely "When That Day Comes," and that once she sets her eyes on the title, Yeon-hee retorts to Lee Han-yeol, "Wake up! No such thing as that day will ever come." Although Yeon-hee initially refuses to join, what is more interesting here is how she fashions her refusal directly against the song's invocation of hope, of the new day. In other words, it is the song itself that she is recognizing as the call to action. As can be glimpsed in the film, songs were an important means of sustaining the democratization movement in 1987 by fostering a culture of movement and reminding those singing or listening to the songs of the cause that brought them together in the first place. In the film, Yeon-hee's transformation from a pessimistic, cynical non-believer to a willing participant of the movement for change is one that is marked by music. Yoo Jae-ha on the one hand, and When That Day Comes on the other. Insofar as the filmmaker's intentions were to recreate the major recognizable arcs of the year of 1987 up until the dawn of a nationwide demonstration, the difference between the two songs is also captured visually in terms of their means of circulation. In the earlier part of the film, Yeon-hee is depicted lounging in the comfort of her room, listening to Yoo Jae-ha's hit song, 가리워진 길, or Hidden Path, being aired on a music program on the radio, followed by her walking down the street with her portable cassette player on, listening to the same song through the privacy of her earphones. By contrast, the only access we have to When That Day Comes is through the mimeographed song sheet that Yeon-hee receives from Lee Han-yeol, the materiality of which is in and of itself a condition of the censorship that forced songs to be created and disseminated through underground means. But beyond the apparent distinction between songs that were sanctioned by the state and those that were censored, we can also see how one song, specifically Yoo Jae-ha's Hidden Path, is tied to the pleasure of private listening, while the other, When That Day Comes is directly implicated in the act of singing, and more importantly, in the act of singing together. After Yeonhee learns of Lee Han-yeol's fatal injury in the newspaper, she reaches her tipping point and begins to move unbeknownst to herself towards the site of protest to join the thickening crowd in their cries demanding protection of the Constitution and overthrow of the dictator. Indeed, in a renewed anticipation of that day to come. The film is brought to a close here with a documentary footage of the June uprising, accompanied by a large ensemble singing of When That Day Comes. As noted by many after watching this film, it was precisely at this point in the film that the audience were moved to tears. In marrying the footage of the democratization movement with the song, and activating a collective pathos, the film demonstrates how songs can conjure up memories of past social movements and how music, and in particular songs, can become an important vehicle for the proliferation of movement ideas beyond their time in history. When That Day Comes is one of the most popular and widely song to have emerged in South Korea's repertoire of protest. As I will explain in more detail later, the song was particularly beloved by those who had been university students in the 1980s and the early part of 1990s. The recognition of When the Day Comes as a prime representative of people's songs has everything to do with the specific event for which the song was written and the kind of alternative future of solidarity and equality that was envisioned through the song. It was written by Moon Seung-hyun, then a graduate student, then a student at, sorry, I lost my track. I'm sorry. It was written, so When the Day Comes was written by Moon Seung-hyun, then a recent graduate of Seoul National University who was working as an amateur songwriter, to be included in a small musical production that was intended for the worker audience. The story told of the late Chun Tae-il, a young garment worker who ended his life in 1970 by setting his own body on fire to protest against the poor working conditions of the laborers, the employer's violation of labor laws, and the authoritarian state that sought to maximize the profit at all costs. The play titled A Spark or 불꽃 was itself a musical adaptation of a biography on Chun Tae-il that was written by a human rights lawyer and activist Jo Young-rae. And this was published in 1983. Although the original playlist of the musical includes several songs, When That Day Comes is the only one that will go on to stand the test of time. In the musical, the song is sung by Chun Tae-il, or the character who plays Chun Tae-il, on the night before he takes his own life. So I will play the song now.
열사요. 김상진 열사요. 장준하 열사요. 김태원 열사요. 황정하 열사요. 김희기 열사요. 김세진 열사요. 이재호 열사요. 이동수 열사요. 김경수 열사요. 김성일 열사요. 강상철 열사요. 송광영 열사요. 박영진 열사요. 황조이천 영영여. 박영만 열사요. 김종태 열사요. 박혜정 열사요. 표정도 열사요. 황보영국 열사요. 박정만 열사요. 홍길 열사요. 박종철 열사요. 오동근 열사요. 김영균 열사요. 이한열 열사요.
Okay, so understanding the lasting popularity of the song necessitates comprehending the underlying aesthetics of the song, especially in light of other notable numbers in this loose genre or loosely categorized genre of people songs. Even though When the Day Comes sings of and forecasts Chantae's death, the lyrics do not, in and of themselves, speak explicitly of a commemoration proper, as with other eulogies of the time, such as My Friend, Liberation is Coming, or 버시어 해방이 온다, or Eulogy for 전태일, 전태일 추모가. And in contrast to a majority of eulogies written for late activists at the time, during this time, in which the living are the ones mourning and honoring the dead, and when that day comes, the speaker is the soon-to-be martyr himself, addressing his brothers of a shared cause. Although his death is imminent, the speaker of the song is proclaiming hope in anticipation of a new day to come. That day in the song is a day of peace, and in the context of 1980s South Korea, is tantamount to nothing less than a democratized society. The imagery deployed throughout the song also facilitates the move towards that day. The status quo is still yet inflicted with suffering, evident in the burning tears and beads of sweat of the speaker's brothers. But there is a power buried in the suffering, the potency of which is exponentially greater because it is a shared experience. The speaker dreams of the day when the individual streams of tears and sweat will join one another to become a strong tidal wave of justice that can actualize peace. From the streams of tears and sweat to a great big wave and finally an ocean The song prophesies through its imagery that a tidal wave of change will be achieved when each strives toward the common goal of justice with a momentum of brotherhood and togetherness. Indeed, it is a metaphorical rendition of how a social movement is to come into being. Herein lay the unique subversive potential of the song, namely in its capacity to call for social change through solidarity and conspicuous absence of politicized terms that came to dominate the more inflammatory protest songs of the 1980s. These terms being 노동 or labor, 해방, liberation, and 투쟁, which means struggle or combat, among other terms as well. At the same time, there is a functioning of intertextuality in the lyrics that makes this song specific to the life of Chun Tae-il. In the aftermath of his death, his last words, "Do not let my death be in vain," became an immortal slogan among South Korean labor activists as well as student protesters. Therefore, we can see how the song's refrain that the speaker's dream would not have been in vain is an allusion to the dying words of the young Chun Tae-il. Chun's protest by suicide occupies an important place in the development of student activism in South Korea. Chun's death alarmed those both in and outside the factories. About the labor conditions and the industry's violation of labor laws, and his willful act of conscience was recognized by many socially minded students as a call to action. His death ultimately triggered the start of what would become known as 노학연대, or Worker Student Alliance, which served as one of the defining characteristics of South Korea's student movement in the 1970s, and particularly so in the 1980s. On some level, the stories surrounding when that day comes are reflective of that Worker Student Alliance as well. The imperative of solidarity with workers can be felt in the song's lyrics too, particularly in the image of shining eyes, okay, or radiant eyes, and the invoking of justice. It took Moon Seung-hyun 7 sleepless nights to write the song, for, quote, "The life and death of the young worker were simply too immense, too grave, and too dazzling to fit into the confined space of one song," end quote. Here he echoed the sentiments of some of the most influential student activists of the time, such as Jang Gi-pyo, who described Chun Tae-il as Jesus Christ. In other words, as the first and most significant martyr of his time, or in the context of Korea, 열사. In the version of the song that you heard today, which is overlaid with the tearful but powerful eulogy for the late Lee Han-yeol, given by the dissident theologian Moon Kwan in 1987, Moon Kwan issues a list of martyrs in a chronological order of their death, beginning with Chun Tae-il and ending with Lee Han-yeol. That Moon Kwan begins with Chun Tae-il as the first recognizable of the martyrs also bears significance, given that there were, in fact, other activists who died as in protest before Chun Tae-il. At the time when Moon Seung-hyun, the songwriter, was commissioned to write this song, he was in charge of running a guitar class for workers through the Cheonggae Garment Workers Union, which is itself a legacy of Chun Tae-il. The musical A Spark, in which the song was incorporated, was a production involving three members of a professional song club called 새벽, or Dawn. It was part of a larger cultural collective called 민중문화운동협의회, or Association of People's Cultural Movement. As Moon Seung-hyun would later reminisce, in the 1980s, members of 새벽 thought of themselves as activists first and artists second. Not only did the title activist suit them better, but it also felt more honorable. Such self-identification of 민중-oriented songwriters like Moon Seung-hyun as activists, however, did not necessarily mean that they prioritized a song's social function over its aesthetic value. On several occasions, Moon has expressed discontent over the untraceable alterations made anonymously to the lyrics over time, where the radiant tears were changed to burning tears, and short-lived memories were changed to painful memories. Because in Moon Seung-hyun's mind, these altered elements undermined the overall imagery that he was striving for in the song. Such emphasis on the aesthetic value of the songs among practitioners of people songs can be traced back to the preceding decade of the 1970s. The development of South Korean song movement is highly indebted to the emergence of song clubs, or noraep'ae, that began during the 1970s. The first of these song clubs was Meari at Seoul National University, which started in 1977. In its early years, divergent musical orientations cohabited the song club. Among these, one group espoused what might be called pure music, with the ultimate intent to participate in the annual 대학 가요제, or College Song Festival, which was considered as a prime platform for those wanting to enter a mainstream pop music industry down the road. The other group of members, the other strand in Meari, thought of songs as prime tools for raising political awareness. Starting in the early 1990s, in the aftermath of Gwangju uprising, songwriter Moon Seung-hyun would emerge as the pillar of this latter cluster of Meari, and become responsible for bringing about the conscientization, or 의식화, of the song club. So as with Meari, while college song clubs did embody the counterculture spirit from their onset, in its incipient years, their activities were not deliberately ideological or political, and neither were their songs necessarily used to articulate political beliefs or assigned with the task of social mobilization. The birth of song clubs in the 1970s and 80s was in and of itself an offshoot of the much more pervasive long tradition and culture of singing together pretty much anywhere and everywhere. In classrooms, at rallies, in tea rooms, and even at drinking bars. Singing was an activity that put many musically gifted students at crossroads with the authoritarian state. And here, this legendary songwriter Kim Min-gi fast emerged as a prime example. The state's caustic measures in and of themselves against collective singing, or singing in large groups, were in and of themselves indicative of the potent nature of songs to engage people. as many campus circles or 동아리 were wont to do around this time. 메아리 also began to incorporate materials geared towards raising social awareness and political consciousness among its members and beyond. Seasonal concerts put together by 메아리 came to be recognized as the official rite of passage for incoming freshmen, as well as continuing students who were yet to be converted, often serving as the venue for student rallies and demonstrations. Song clubs that were sprouting at different schools, such as 한소리 at Ihwa and 울림터 at Yonsei, among others, these song clubs often collaborated with each other to organize underground activism through the writing of and singing socially conscious songs while disseminating banned ones. As a case in point, it was through much of the work of these noraep'aes or song clubs that one of the most potent protest song of the 1980s, which is 임을 위한 행진곡 or March for the Beloved, that was originally written to commemorate Gwangju. It was really through these song clubs that the song traveled from Gwangju, where it was clandestinely produced, and then became sort of disseminated and sung amongst these song club members. And that's how it ended up becoming the resistance song of the 1980s par excellence. So it can be argued that the song movement was an amalgamation of the pervasive culture of singing and the student activists' renewed sense of urgency and need to create socially grounded songs. However, the movementization of such activities did not come about until 1984, with the advent of the first professional singing group to emerge in South Korea. This was 새벽, or dawn, which was organized by 민문협, or the Association of People's Cultural Movement, as well as the graduating seniors and recent alums of campus song clubs. And these, the recent alums and seniors graduating class included songwriters like Moon Sung-yeon, who wrote 그날이 오면, or When That Day Comes. 새벽, or dawn, was the first organization to systematically engage in fostering a movement through such means as starting the first ever academic publication on popular music, which was a MOOC, or the hybrid between magazine and book, a popular form of irregular publications in 1980s. And that was for the most part led by one of the most prolific popular music scholar, Kim Chang-nam. Okay. And in addition, they held regular concerts and attended rallies, and also went into the labor sector to teach songs and sometimes even instruments to workers. It was by a stroke of luck that from these campus song clubs emerged the first and only multi-member vocal group to sing people's songs proper on mainstream television and radio. Okay. Albeit in the years subsequent to the country's transition to procedural democracy in 1987. Formed out of collaboration between the legendary Kim Min-gi and lead members of the song group 새벽, the group was given the name 노차사, which is an acronym for 노래를 찾는 사람들, or people in search of songs, a moniker that was itself a testament to the group's roots in an era that condemned such frivolities as dreaming of entering mainstream music scene, a time when crowd singing or 떼창 was much more of a prized virtue than taking a prominent solo singing. So here we might ask, what is the relevance of the culture of collective singing and the protest songs of the authoritarian era um, um, in contemporary South Korean society? Most apparently, we may recall that many of the songs sung and the performers performing them at the 2016-2017 impeachment rallies, for instance, were those who made their name during the peak of anti-authoritarian resistance in the 1970s and democratization movement in the 1980s. Notable ones here being the folk singer Yang Hyun and rocker Chun In-kwon, and singer-songwriter An Chi-wan. And this last one, An Chi-wan, he was also one of the original members of Nochasa. At a time when the darker times of military authoritarianism appear to have become a bygone era, these artists and their songs on the stage at the rallies re-emerged as living proof of the culture of sonic protest that the 70s and the 80s had harnessed and spread. In 1989, so 2 years after Luchasa would begin to perform publicly in legal venues. So in 1989, Luchasa would entertain a surge of popularity, indeed without a single appearance on mainstream television or radio. So how surprising is it that in 1989, when their hit number Sage came out, Sage ranked number 3 in a TV music program called Gayo Top 10, which is as pop-oriented as a TV music program can get. And yet, their popularity among the mainstream listenership was rather short-lived. So starting in the early 1990s, by the mid 1990s, their songs had really sort of dissipated and diffused away from the mainstream audience and venues for the mainstream audience. And the lack of interest among the broader listenership, we can say, was reflective of the difference between the kind of economy through which Minjungayo operated and the kind of economy through which popular music in South Korea operated. There is a certain culture of authenticity that was imbued to the songs of Nochasa vis-a-vis their connection to the preceding culture of noraep'ae or song clubs that were all about singing in places that needed songs as a way to garner solidarity among people and to spread ideas about social inequality or political injustice. And the kind of histories that were attached to the songs no longer bore that much relevance in post-1987 South Korea. Another reason for which these songs started to lose popularity among the listenership might be better illuminated by returning to the film 1987, with which I began my talk today, to think about the difference between the only 2 recognizable songs that were included in the film, which were 유재하's 가리워진 길 on the one hand, and 문승현's 그날이 오면. So in the years following his untimely accidental death in 1987, Ujeha's songs would go on to be marked for its timelessness. How Koreans put it is 세월이 흘러도 영원한. On the other hand, songs that fell into this loose category of 민중가요, including When That Day Comes, and the shared sense of 현장, or what might be translated as sightedness, and the kinds of experience of the 1980s social movement to which the song was connected, was defined precisely not by its timelessness, but by its time-boundedness, that soon lost its appeal once the cause for singing these songs in the form of 떼창 or crowd singing no longer had much credence and appeal for the mainstream audience. But while Nochasa's experiment in the late 1980s and early 1990s fell short of retaining mainstream popularity, the series of struggles against social injustice and political corruption in 21st century South Korea have proven time and again that the relationship between politics and song that defined the song movement of the 1980s is one that still endures. To be sure, since the 1980s, the musical repertoire of protests have grown much more varied in South Korea. As a case in point, I would like to share a recent example from 2016. When students of Ewha Women's University engaged in a months-long protest against the university's plans to build a college of continuing education in spite of the students' opposition. The students' condemnation of the university's capitalistic venture brought to surface an admissions scandal involving the daughter of Choi Soon-sil, who was former President Park Geun-hye's close friend and confidant. So what began as a university's internal investigation that over the course of the students' protest led to the ouster of the university's president and went on to spark a parliamentary investigation of the so-called Choi Soon-sil Gate that would ultimately lead to the ouster of the country's president. The song that was sung by the Ewha student protesters, linked arm in arm as they faced something of 1,600 police officers, was the one that was played before I began my talk today. So for those of you who were able to catch the tune before the talk, and for those of you who are well-versed in K-pop, you may have recognized it. The song is 다시 만난 세계, or Into the New World, which is the debut single of 소녀시대 or Girls' Generation. So since 2016, the song has been sung and heard in various and somewhat unexpected places. And this was after it was sung by the Ewha students in earlier part of 2016. Okay. So it would be heard in unexpected places like the impeachment rallies in South Korea that ensued the same year, and even during the Women's March in New York, and during an anti-government rally in Bangkok, Thailand, just last month. So if such repurposing of songs proves anything, it may be that it is not just the song or where the song originated and for what purpose, but the act of singing together that is the most powerful means of bringing people to action, and that happens to be the most significant legacy of the South Korean song movement of the 1980s. Thank you.